Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
I'm Sandra, and I'm just the professional your small business was looking for. But you didn't hire me because you didn't use LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn has professionals you can't find anywhere else, including those who aren't actively looking for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role, like me.
In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you'll miss out on great candidates like Sandra. Start hiring professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Even on a budget, quality is non-negotiable. That's why Quince is the place to score high-end essentials at 50 to 80% less than similar brands. Get your hands on buttery soft cashmere sweaters from just $60, Italian leather jackets, and so much more. And the best part about Quince, they exclusively partner with factories committed to safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing. Elevate your style without the elevated price tag with Quince. Go to quince.com/upgrade for free shipping and 365-day returns.
Hello and welcome to the Napoleonicist and the final interview of Irish Month. Today I'm joined by Andrew Dorman, a PhD candidate at Dublin City University, whose research examines the experience of the soldier in Ireland in the 18th century. He's also the recipient of an Irish Research Council scholarship and is actually a pretty good comedian. But no, that isn't a comment on the quality of his research. Andrew, it's great to have you on the show, despite having just roasted you in the intro. How are you doing?
That's fine. I'm good. I'm just glad I now know how to pronounce your podcast name.
Yeah, soft C, essentially. Yeah. Otherwise, it ends up being Napoleonicist, which sounds a little bit peculiar, but we won't go there.
It's more of a Josephine podcast, I feel.
Yes. Let's take the radical approach of starting at the beginning. So what's the nature of the force deployed in Ireland in the sort of early 18th century, perhaps even earlier? Because I know you told me that you want to take us all the way back to 1690, which is going to enrage some of our listeners.
I know. I mean, I'm dragging the Napoleonic listeners right back to the 1600s, but to understand the situation in Ireland, you do have to go back that far. I mean, arguably you could go back a little bit further, but I'll stop at 1690, 1691, because that's the end of what's known as the Williamite War. Well, Williamite War or War of James II, depending on where you go. It's a sideshow of the War of the League of Augsburg, which is going on in Europe, but this obviously follows William of Orange coming over, kicking James II out. He flees to Ireland, subsequently to France. But most of this conflict is fought on Irish soil. It's very bloody. It's quite short, quite sharp. And it culminates at the Siege of Limerick, with the Irish army being told either you can stay or you can, and we'll disarm you, or you can go to France. So most of them flee to France. So for the new authorities, they are just coming out of quite a bitter conflict in which you had Catholics supporting James and Protestants typically supporting William. There were obviously exceptions to that. And the concern is that there will be another Catholic insurrection. Another more legitimate concern is that you will have a French invasion to reinstate James, because Louis XIV was fairly committed to supporting the Jacobite cause. And he also, I believe, when James eventually dies, he publishes support for his son as well. Now, this is meaningless, but it's still, from a Protestant perspective, a genuine threat to their sort of assets in Ireland. So to this end, it's decided that Ireland would basically host 12,000 soldiers at any given time. And this is probably one of the largest deployments of soldiers in Ireland. I think you might have slightly higher during the 1920s, and again during the 1798 rebellion there's a mass distribution of soldiers, but typically this is definitely up there in terms of size. They're going to be housed in a modern barracks network, and this is something that's often overlooked. Ireland has the most widespread and modern barrack network in the world at this stage, arguably. And its primary objective is to defend against French invasion, protect Protestant interests, and then as sort of a secondary, it's designed to suppress potential Catholic uprisings. It coincides with the implementation of the penal laws, but it's not necessarily the sort of MO of the soldiers to implement these laws. It's more to be at the beck and call of the authorities if they needed, but the primary thing is to be the defense against invasion. So you've got 12,000 men in Ireland, and this will last as a separate organization until the Act of Union. These are paid for by Dublin Castle. So this isn't British Army in Ireland, it's the army, it's the Irish Army in essence, or an army in Ireland. And as I said, paid for, housed, all within its own establishment. And it's, as the century progresses, it turns into this more barracks for the empire. Soldiers are kept here and then dispersed as and when they're needed elsewhere. And that's sort of its more imperial objective. So on the smaller scale, on a sort of a strategic level in Ireland, it's to protect against French invasion, but then on an imperial strategic level, it's a barracks.
Why house them in barracks? And the reason I ask that is because that's quite unusual and quite advanced for the time. If you look at what happens across much of Europe, you find that barracks aren't really a thing. They have to kind of be designed, particularly during the Napoleonic era. And there are lots of kind of conversations about what is and isn't appropriate within a barrack environment. So why the focus on barracks so early on?
Well, part of it is to do with the need for a wide sort of suppression level across the country. And if you can disperse regiments, but not have them billeted with, the population, but in separate barracks, you can put them in the countryside and they won't go wandering, I suppose. So there's that element to it. So you have lots of barracks which have now since been converted into things like coach houses and pubs, because Ireland. But a lot of these old like B&Bs and stuff dotted around the countryside used to be barracks. So there's that side of it. It's the casting a wide net and hoping to suppress as much as possible. But also, this comes back to the fact that a established army is a very new phenomenon. I mean, you're talking, if you want to go back to maybe the English Civil War, but really it's the sort of 1670s, 80s, where the British, or 60s, I suppose, where the British Army really starts to set itself as a permanent force. And there was a lot of anti-army feeling. So why not try this out in Ireland, where I guess we can put it down to suppressing Catholics and use it as a test bed, and it seemed to work. I mean, the Dublin barracks is now Collins Barracks in the centre of the city. It's one of the nicest buildings in the city. And then you've got barracks in all the major urban areas, and as I said, also in the rural areas too. So keeps the soldiers in check. You know where they are. It's easier to manage, and also keeps them healthier to a degree too. Ireland has a different disease climate, so you want them out of the field as much as possible. So that's a factor in it too.
And how does all of this change over time then?
So as you go through the century, infrastructurally speaking, going back to the barracks quickly, you have more permanent buildings being built. But in terms of their role, it does change, their practical role. Because as I said, from a grand strategic perspective, it doesn't really change. It's always going to be there to prevent invasion. The French only actually land, if we exclude the 1790s, once in 1760. And they capture a town called Carrickfergus and are then repelled. It's quite embarrassing for all concerned, including the French. But from the more real sort of what they're up to, from 1690 to about 1730s, 1740s, most of what the army is doing is they're being strong men for the Revenue Commission. So they are aiding in tax collection, they're overturning whiskey stills, they're tracking down smugglers, deserters, they're trying to prevent recruitment for the French army, this kind of thing. Now, it's not particularly popular work, but it is at least stable. So there's an understanding that the army will be the guards of captured goods, for example, and there's that degree of connection with the society, I guess. Now, this changes as you progress into the century because you come across more instances of urban unrest and agitation and rural agitation as well. But you also have the army being increasingly called upon elsewhere. As I said, it was a barracks for empire at this stage. So War of the Austrian Succession, the garrison is gutted. You lose 9 regiments. Most of them are sent abroad. I think they go to UK and then onto the Indies or into continental Europe. So you've got a now depleted garrison having to deal with increased unrest. So that's where you have a lot of the clashes starting to emerge, and you've got a increased number of disciplinary issues, lots of soldiers doing things they really shouldn't be, and this just gets worse and worse as you go on. And as you move into the second half of the century, the army-societal relationship is in a very bad way, and that's when you have the emergence of a lot of large-scale agrarian protest, things like the White Boys, the Right Boys, the Oak Boys, the Hearts of Steel. There's a theme with the names. There's a lot of boys going on. Not a lot of female representation in these movements, clearly. Well, actually there is, but that's a different story. But you have the army being called upon to deal with gatherings of hundreds or indeed thousands of protesters, often resorting to violence, but there's more of like sort of a crackdown or that side of things. So their role evolves and changes throughout the century. And by the time you get to the 1790s, the army-societal relationship, depending on who you read, is either in tatters or improving, but it's not great, for sure.
So, I mean, what strikes me as really interesting here is that you talk about how the garrison ends up being depleted, but the thing that the British government then starts to do much later on is send troops that they're going to deploy overseas to Ireland for a sort of acclimatization period before then shipping them on. So what changes, if you like? I mean, we might be jumping ahead in the story, but what changes in that philosophy?
Well, I think that one of the reasons why they're able to do that comes down to reforms that are put in place in the 1770 and 1771, because prior to that, Irish regiments were actually kept at a smaller number, or they had fewer soldiers in them. The idea was that you could maintain an officer corps and then some veterans, and then you could very easily supplement those with new recruits, get a fairly large regiment on the cheap, and then ship that abroad. So you had this sort of cadre system where you had a corps of soldiers that could be easily added to. In 1770, 1771, it's decided, let's scrap this and let's just have them at the same level as sort of soldiers on the continent, soldiers in Britain, Scotland, what have you. There's a massive recruitment drive, and Ireland, basically an Irish regiment is now the same as an English regiment. But prior to that, you wouldn't have been able to do that kind of acclimatization or sending them to Ireland for a little bit. But despite that, you would have had a fairly constant rotation of soldiers into and out of Ireland, given the nature, again, of this barrack sort of system. So if a regiment was going to the East Indies, it might spend time in Ireland simply because it's closer. And if you're sailing from Cork anyway, or West Indies rather, if you're sailing from Cork anyway, why not spend some time there and do some training? So you do have a flow in and out, but I think it becomes more sort of administratively it's sort of recognizable as you get into more the 19th century. And that's when you get the emergence of that sort of system that you're describing there.
So, I mean, you talked earlier about how, depending on who you read, people either like the Irish army, if you will, the British Army in Ireland, or they absolutely loathe it. So who's sitting on the two sides of this polarized discussion?
Right. So that comes down to sort of the idea of reputation and how the army is perceived. And so much of that really goes back to the 1760s. In order to understand the 1790s, you really have to go back that far. This is a period, at least in the 1760s, where the army abroad is covering itself in glory. You know, Wolf, Quebec, India, all of these sort of victories. In Ireland, you're dealing with massive urban unrest, and in the 1770s, the rise of a phenomenon known as hawking in urban areas. Now, hawking was essentially a terror campaign embarked on against the army by butchers. So they would go behind soldiers at night, knock them to the ground, and then mutilate them by slashing their legs. Now, that's designed specifically to render them useless as a soldier. It sends a message. It permanently maims them in the same way branding or removing, chopping the hand off a thief sends a message. So there's over 100 cases of this in the 1770s and 1780s. So the army is in urban areas. It's controversial at the best of times because incidences emerge then of soldiers hawking themselves. So you have an army that is being defeated in America and is going through a crisis of identity there. And then you have soldiers who are missing out on maybe helping or winning that battle, now being attacked at home in an alien environment as well. And then layer on top of that again the emergence of the volunteer movement in Ireland, who are first established to prevent French invasion during the American War of Independence, but quickly this grows into a new radical way to express militarism and loyalty. So the volunteer movement, and you're talking tens and thousands of members across the country, they're so prevalent and professional, they're actually given charge of the defense of Ulster when there's this fear of French invasion. These are a serious group. And people begin to look at the army and think, well, why are you here? We do not need you as a police force. We have the volunteers. If we're going to be invaded by the French, the volunteers can take care of it. Why are you even here? So that's where a lot of the anti-militarism sort of comes into it. And it sort of peaks in 1784. There's a very embarrassing incident for the army whereby several officers get absolutely hammered, as they tended to, and they attempt to break into someone's bar. The barman, who is a volunteer, tells them to get out. They start teasing him because he's a volunteer, and I quote, they tweak his nose. This leads to him taking out his musket and driving them out. The soldiers then come back and say, we were joking. Then they grab the musket and throw it into the river. So all of this back and forth leads to rioters emerging, and what's concerning is the officers are driven off by stones, but then attempt to summon the garrison to teach this guy a lesson. So that's the level of tension that you see sort of in the city at this stage. So the situation is very poor in the 1780s, particularly around 1784, and it gradually starts to piece itself back together by the 1790s, but it's a long process. And that's particularly in the urban areas, I suppose.
So you were talking about how people look at the volunteers and go, look, we've got our own kind of internal defence force. You know, the volunteers can handle it. Is that fair in terms of the quality of them, or is that just kind of the popular perception that, look, we've got some people, they know how to use a gun, they're kind of disciplined, that's an army?
Yeah, I think you're definitely talking about style over substance, because as much as you can't take, like, a lot of the British regiments are fairly veteran at this stage. Like, they know how to fight, whereas these guys, they are primarily civilians. They might have been part of maybe the militia previously, but they've got very fancy uniforms, which they've paid for themselves. But are they really soldiers? No, I don't think so. And they're never battle tested either. At least the militia, as I said, during that 1760 invasion, proved itself to be able to erect some barricades for the soldiers to stand behind. But the volunteers are never properly given military training. And to be honest, they become more of a political force. So Ireland at this stage is looking for free trade between it and England. And the volunteers, for example, they hang signs on cannons saying free trade or else and park them outside of Parliament. It's that kind of intimidation factor, and they become a political thing. And Henry Grattan, who I'm sure you're familiar with, comes to Parliament in his volunteer uniform. It's that sort of thing. So it becomes very much a political thing, more so than a military.
Interesting. So cannons outside Parliament.
That's how you do diplomacy,
nice.
Zach.
Yeah, great. I mean, we could make a comment about Napoleon's use of cannon in the defence of governments, but let's not go there because we want to stay focused on Ireland. You mentioned that things gradually get kind of pieced back together in terms of what was quite a toxic relationship across as you move into the 1790s. But then, of course, 1798, you have the rebellion. So what does that do to the whole relationship?
Well, I mean, 1798 it's in a way, it kind of comes out of nowhere from the military's perspective, because republicanism. Now, I think James Deere is probably in a better position to talk about this than I am, as I deliberately stop my deep dive research just before this because that would add like 4 chapters to my thesis. But Republicanism is very much a fringe movement at this stage, and the fact that it gained so much support, I think they end up turning out, I think, 100,000 people, which is shocking to the army, and that kind of explains their initial successes. But as far as I'm aware, it's the militia that handle most of the 1798 rebellion. So it's not really this redeeming moment for the army. Just prior, I'm fairly sure Lord Abercrombie described the army as the worst I've ever seen and more of a danger to itself than the enemy, or something like that. I'm paraphrasing. Now, he had just been transferred post, and it's very much got the sort of energy of someone who was leaving a job and leaving a bad review on Glassdoor. Like, it's not really necessarily the best source. I think the army had improved at that stage, but 1798, I mean, with the Castlebar races, humiliates them, but they do eventually suppress it. And when one looks at the sort of the feeling afterwards, a lot of the ire is directed at British army. When you look at the Irish Legion in French service under Napoleon, a lot of their soldiers are really disappointed that they don't get to tackle the British army in Spain. They spend most of their time fighting against guerrillas, but they really want to fight against Sir John Moore, because obviously he played quite a key role in the suppression of 1798. So that kind of that there is that feeling of it's their fault, and that will continue as we progress through the volunteer movement, or not the volunteer, the Republican movement for going forward.
So they're quite keen to take on Moore. How do they feel about Wellington being Anglo-Irish? Is he still part of the problem, or?
Yeah, I think Wellington's an interesting character to consider, because there is, I think if you were Anglo-Irish, and most of the British army officers who were Irish would definitely be of that sort of caste, he's one of us, and he will, I guess, understand what we've come through and that. But for your average Irishman, I don't think there's ever that sense that he is in any way on our team. I could be wrong in that, but as far as I know, he's never really seen as a figure that is fighting our corner, I suppose. He's controversial for sure, but when one considers how, he does give good, he gives credit where it's due for the actions of, the Inniskillings of Waterloo and that kind of thing. And obviously his role in Parliament later comes to play as well. But I don't feel it's personal, I suppose. It's difficult to really nail down how they exactly feel about him. And I reckon it probably becomes more of a thing or more of an issue when he becomes Prime Minister. And that's when the discourse really begins. And you have comments attributed to him that he may not have actually said, and that kind of thing.
Yeah,
coming about.
That old famous one that's actually from O'Connell about being born in a stable, for example. Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting one for me. See, when I first kind of thought about these, I was kind of thinking in terms of there being a distinction in Ireland between the kind of Catholic Irish, to give it a very crude title, and then your sort of Anglo-Irish, your Protestant settlers, and these different groups being quite polarized. And as I've interviewed people over the course of this month, I've kind of started to question that perception, because I think it's probably a bit too simplistic. What's your reading, first of all, about these different factions? Because it's interesting to listen to Katrina, where she's saying that actually there's a move towards focusing on Irishness as opposed to this this division based on religion. But equally, there are these different groups within society who must have had different experiences and interactions with the army.
Right. So I think that, is that Katrina Kennedy?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's very much a 19th century thing, where one takes a step back from religion and considers sort of Irishness. When one looks at the 18th century, religion definitely plays a more of a role, particularly in the early half. Bearing in mind again that the fears of a Catholic uprising in support of James II being Catholic, obviously that's going to be a fairly real danger. And it's Catholic Irish who are disarmed. They are the ones, the penal laws, who are sort of legislated against. And they're the ones who flee to France and fight against the English in French service. So at least up until 1745, with the sort of death of the Jacobite movement, on the field of Culloden in 1746-5. I think it's fair to make the distinction between Protestant and Catholic. They would have very different experiences. The Protestant population are probably enjoying a more positive relationship, as these are our protectors. You'll have instances of soldiers marrying into sort of wealthy families. Even the rankers are given opportunities to teach children for a few extra pennies on the side, that kind of thing. However, I think from 1750, a better division in terms of experience might be between rural and urban, because it's probably a little bit more nuanced to look at wealth than religion, and the rural experience is very different to the urban experience. You've got, as I've mentioned, all those various boys, white boys, right boys, etc. And the army is called in to suppress these. And these are fighting for fairly basic land reform, or that they want just essentially, they want what's due to them, and it's the military that are called out to fight them or fight against them. Typically, dragoon regiments or private dragoon regiments are established. One landowner attempts to set up his own hussar regiment because he thinks people are more likely to join if I make the uniform fancy. He is told no, set up a proper regiment, and eventually he does. But it's this kind of vigilantism combined with military suppression. So the rural relationship is unlikely to be fully positive. Now, this does evolve. From the 1760s, 1780s, it's a different story. And when you come to the right boy movement, you have the military not turning guns on them, but instead opting for a show of force. So they take 2,000 men out of Dublin and march them through the countryside with cannon in tow, just to show them that we will deal with you if we have to. And that actually seems to work. So there's an evolution of strategy there and a change in that relationship. And there seems to be a degree of respect established there. In the city, much of what the army does is riot suppression, tackling criminals, chasing them down, dealing with factional violence. Dublin in this period is riven by factional divisions. Particularly, there's two groups called the Ormond and Liberty Boys. They bash each other fairly consistently throughout the century, and the army is called in. It's basically the third gang that is dragged in to suppress these guys. So I think in the city and in the countryside, you have two very distinct views of the military, but whether it comes down to Catholic, Protestant, it's difficult to really gauge. It's worth bearing in mind as well that you're more likely to have Protestants in the army, obviously, because it was illegal to recruit Catholics, but really there shouldn't have been any Irish in the army at all. It was illegal to recruit Irishmen for much of the century. The idea being you need the Protestants here to keep the Catholics in check. Obviously, we don't want to arm the Catholics. That's terrifying. So this obviously doesn't come to pass because we know that there was at least 25-30% numbers throughout the 18th century, but that recruitment is strictly clandestine or strictly done during conflict and was seen as an act of desperation. For most of the time, you don't want Irishmen in the army, so it is still this distinct alien body. It's not our army, it's an army that is here, if that sort of makes sense.
Yeah, that's interesting, because it takes me back to something else that came up with Katrina Kennedy's interview, where we were talking about the extent to which Ireland kind of becomes a laboratory for empire. This is a phrase that I'm not sure who said it, but it's not Katrina's original phrase, but I thought it was a really nice way of describing it. Do you see that? Do you kind of look at how Britain operates in terms of trying to quash unrest in Ireland and see parallels in what's used elsewhere in the empire?
Hey, it's Danny Pellegrino from Everything Iconic. Ready to upgrade your style game without blowing your budget? Check out Quince. They've got all the good stuff, shirts and polos, activewear, and fine leather goods, all at 50 to 80% less than other high-end brands. And the best part? They're all about safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing. Get that luxury vibe without the luxury price tag. Hit up quince.com/upgrade for free shipping and 365-day returns on your next order. That's quince.com/upgrade.
I'm Sandra, and I'm just the professional your small business was looking for. But you didn't hire me because you didn't use LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn has professionals you can't find anywhere else, including those who aren't actively looking for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role, like me.
In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you'll miss out on great candidates like Sandra. Start hiring professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
I think that you could probably draw parallels from a lot of what the military experience with barracks in particular, and those elements, the sort of integration among population side of things, you probably could draw distinctions. But at the same time, Ireland is in this bizarre limbo in terms of legislation, where a lot of the laws, such as, for example, England, you have a riot act which goes back, I can't remember how far, but it's just well established for most of the 18th century. There isn't one in Ireland for most of it. So there is this unwillingness to try some of the more repressive, maybe, or denial of freedom legislations, however you want to phrase it, in Ireland. I think this does change with the Act of Union, because now that it's officially part of, the kingdoms, or kingdom now, singular, it's easier to sort of enact that kind of legislation. But there's a fear, I guess, and because Ireland has its own parliament as well, it has a degree of autonomy, and it doesn't necessarily allow itself to be that laboratory for at least a while in the century. Now, when I say autonomy, Irish Parliament still could not pass laws under Poyning's law without first running it by Westminster, so it's not really autonomy, but it's at least a shade of it. It would be interesting to look into how they treat, or the penal laws compared to maybe some of the treatment of natives, perhaps, or Native Americans, and during the sort of French Indian War sort of era, and see if there's any sort of disarming or anything like that. But that's not something I'm too familiar with. But I now just have an idea. So
fair enough. There's the next book sorted for you.
Yeah, that's my weekend.
So how do, and obviously you can't kind of generalize about everybody's experience, but how today do folks from Ireland remember this period, the 1790s, the Napoleonic Wars? Because the British obviously aren't hugely popular during the period. We've thankfully had the Good Friday Agreement and so on, and that's managed to stabilize relations in Ireland. But it always strikes me that there can't be vast amounts of love for the Brits, given the complexity of the history. So how is this period remembered, or is it just kind of eclipsed by things like the Easter Uprising and so on?
Yeah, as I say, I don't want to put words in the mouth of the nation, but to be honest, 1798 people are aware of. There are statues of pikemen dotted around the southeast in various towns, and I think probably Cork as well. They tend to rebel a lot. But I think a lot of the sort of romanticism of it is more of a 19th century phenomenon. When you have the rise of cultural nationalism and the identity of Irishness and that sort of thing, that does come to be. Nowadays, I mean, people might be aware of the Act of Union. You're unlikely to have people knowing who Wellington is, unless they are a historian. It's not like in England, I suppose, where you've got a lot of pubs named after the man in some capacity. There isn't that like popular history element to him very much. He's not ingrained in the social consciousness. Whereas 1798, you will have songs written about it and folk music, and there might be a pub named after that. So it's kind of forgotten for a lot of it. The entire 18th century is typically just categorized as the penal laws. And it's kind of easy to just think, oh, it's one of those centuries of Irish-English negative relationships. I don't think it would, at the time, might be a different story, particularly around the Act of Union, because the Act of Union was supposed to bring about Catholic emancipation and get rid of the penal laws. At least that was the carrot that was dangled in front of Catholics to support it, and the clergy and that. Now, this was obviously lies, but nonetheless, I think at the time you would have seen a degree of support for the Act of Union. Obviously not among the Republicans, but among the general population, maybe. And that might also explain why so many Irish then sign up to join the army of the Duke of Wellington, right? Because you've got the establishment, things like the Connacht Rangers and this kind of thing. So, it's a tricky question, but it is very much I think the looking back on it takes place more in the 19th than the 20th and 21st centuries. And that the Irish diaspora seem particularly enamored with it. One of the regiments in the American Civil War that forms the Irish Brigade under Mayer, or Marr, sorry, it declares itself the 88th New York. Now, that's not how the numerical system worked, but it wanted to be the 88th New York in sympathy with the Connacht Rangers. So I think people sort of look back on the Napoleonic period maybe 50 years or so more than they would now, because I guess it's more living memory at that stage, but it's not really a feature here.
So is it
much
not
to my chagrin?
Well, no, that's the crying shame of what we do, isn't it? People like to just kind of forget about the stuff that fascinates us. So is it not taught in schools then, this period?
No, you would typically start, you might get the Act of Union, maybe. But most of what is taught starts deep in the 19th century. You're talking Land War, the Famine, Parnell, O'Connell, these figures, and it's all setting the stage more so for what comes in the 1910s, 1920s. But really, the run up to it is pretty much ignored. You might have a chapter on Napoleon and the French Revolution, but really it's not really taught all that well. Waterloo might be mentioned, maybe,
yes,
but the Irish contribution isn't, for sure.
No, that's not dissimilar to what we have over here, which is, you might get Trafalgar mentioned, you might vaguely get Waterloo, but really it's just kind of pushed to the side. Let's jump it straight into empire and slavery. I want to take it back to something that you mentioned a little bit earlier, which was about the army and Wellington and the interplay between the two. Because for me, there's this interesting dichotomy where the English aren't popular in Ireland. The English are fearful of Irish descent. And yet you've got, as we've said, and as I discussed with Jim, anywhere between 25 to 30% of the army being Irish.
Yeah.
Why? I mean, I put this question to Jim. Is this just desperation? Is it something about the character of the Irish people that makes folks think that actually, it's quite useful to have some Irish lads in the army? What's your reading of it?
Well, I mean, we've got a good history of selling ourselves as soldiers, I should specify. Let's keep things PC. But I think that we've got a long history of fighting for pretty much every country in Europe, which goes back, I mean, Irishmen supported Thomas Simmel's attempt at the crown at one stage. It goes back a long way. There's reports in Spanish military history of Irishmen being very cheap to run, that you only need to give them one meal a day and they will march for the rest of it. So we've got quite a good sort of legacy in that regard. And when one looks at the 18th century, yes, it was illegal to recruit Irishmen, but the Irishmen that were recruited for the French service cover themselves in glory at the beginning. Like the War of the Spanish Succession is amazing for Irish prestige. If one looks at the exploits of sort of Clare's regiment, Lee's, Donington, the various Irish brigade regiments in French service, battles like Blenheim, Malplaquet, they're the ones who actually hold the line while the French run away, if you want to be really cliche about it. And somewhere War of the Spanish Succession historian is cursing my name at this stage, but he knows I'm right. Nonetheless, when one moves further into the 18th century and that because the Jacobite cause dies off and you got less French recruitment, Ireland's, like, for the average person, Ireland's boring as hell. I mean, if you don't want to be an agricultural farmer or a laborer in a city, there isn't really much scope, particularly, you're still kind of second-class citizens. So enlistment isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world if you want adventure. And in terms of economy, Ireland is very poor. By the 1800s, if you want a comparison to a modern economy, England is about the same sort of economic level as Egypt would be today. Ireland is the same as Somalia. Like, this is a seriously poor nation. So obviously you're going to have people wanting to enlist. It's also seen as a sign of loyalty too. In this period where whether or not the Irish are good little subjects, and being subservient is always up in the air. If you join the army, it's a surefire way of saying, yes, I am loyal, particularly for the officers. So there's a lot of Anglo-Irish wanting to join the army to sort of really cement that and show, yes, I do believe in the cause, and I want to fight for the king, and that kind of thing. And yeah, I think a lot of it does come down to boredom too. I'm sure that cropped up with Jimmy as well, and how it's just, there is nothing to do here, and if you can fight, even if it's in a red coat, even if you have to be recruited illegally, and the way they go about recruiting them was always very entertaining to me. They would often ship them to Scotland and sign them up in Scotland, so they are officially registered as Scottish recruits. But then they'll bring them back to Ireland and say, okay, we can sign up legally now, you don't have to worry about it. The only loophole on that was when they only spoke Irish. But, we can gloss over that and sort of move on from that, I guess, in the official reports. The desertion postings in particular often will specify what accent they speak in, and usually it's Irish.
Interesting. Do they do, in your period, do they do the classic thing of getting them drunk as well before they slip them the king's shilling?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially the French recruiters who come over, because all of what they're doing is very, very under the radar and illegal, and they're at risk of being shot if they get caught. So they will usually use a bar as sort of their recruiting office, with a friendly, sympathizing barman on a sympathizing road. And there's a really hilarious case study I've come across where the barman is arrested and the recruitment officer is arrested, and they're testified against by this one person, but the entire street then testifies against the person who testifies against them, because he's known to be a rat, and just he's a huge fan of like the British or whatever, and he's just he's just seen as this loyalist scumbag who's undermining the Jacobite cause, and he's a man of no character at all. So that definitely does play like a factor in it as well, that because it has to be kind of clandestine, and if you get someone drunk, they're more likely to join. And they will, there's a fear among the recruits that they're going to be shipped to like the East Indies or the West Indies. And the people will say like, oh, if I drink this, let it be poisoned, if I'm not lying to you or whatever. It's all very shady and very illegal. And obviously Ireland, alcohol, it's going to be a beautiful relationship. I don't know if you've come across it in your own studies, but it's a doctor's report in Ireland as to why all of the regiments in Ireland have really bad sores on their legs due to excessive whiskey consumption. It doesn't necessarily do the stereotype much favors, and a lot of them are fairly new recruits. So yeah, definitely plays a factor.
Yeah, I mean, you've got massive issues of alcoholism in the entire army, haven't you? I remember there was a study recently of Gibraltar and the efforts to close down bars there, and just the utterly impossible situation that you generate, where you've got these alcohol dependent men who are given alcohol through their rations, and just being incapable of managing the situation, and discipline sort of falling apart essentially because these men are going pretty much cold turkey.
Yeah, and you have instances of people setting up bars next to barracks, because again, you have barracks in cities. They're obviously the fancy building made of stone. There's probably some money in there. So they'll set up sutlers and stuff all around them. And the soldiers have a very easy access. And again, at the start of the century, they're tipping over whiskey stills. I'm reckoning they're filling their canteens before they do that. I think that wouldn't necessarily be a stretch to say.
It really would.
And it's obviously Ireland, the stereotype of us being alcoholics exists at this point. When one looks at the diaries of various officers, particularly in the 1780s, one suggests that the reason everyone drinks in Ireland is because our stories are so boring that they have to be told to drunkards for them to be entertaining. The other is that potatoes are so easy to grow that you've got nothing else to do for the rest of the day, so you might as well make and drink whiskey. So again, not necessarily the most accurate hypotheses, but the people are trying to figure us out, if nothing else.
Yeah, that's bizarre, but the Brits not necessarily always known for their enlightened attitudes to other nations.
No.
I'm interested in what you say about some Irish soldiers serving in armies across Europe, but particularly the French during this period. What can you tell us about Irish troops in the French army during the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars?
Okay, so French Revolution, you have the disbandment of the old Ancien Regime Irish Brigade. I think actually a lot of them are offered service in England. That is something for you to look at, because that is more your period. But yeah, no, I think that the old sort of, particularly Clare's regiment, who I did my master's thesis on, they are disbanded around this period, and some of them are given offers to come back to fight for the English, or they just integrate themselves into French society. But to be honest, at that stage, much of the Ancien Regime Irish Brigade wasn't Irish. It was getting increasingly difficult to recruit soldiers, particularly as recruitment in England was becoming more accepted. So you didn't need to go to France to join an army and get that wage and have your adventure. You could do it locally and not also worry about getting shot for treason. Coming into the age of Napoleon, now I'm aware that Napoleon does have an Irish legion commanded by a man called Bernard McSheedy. They wore green. They had a special green flag with 4 harps, 1 in each corner. And as I mentioned, they fight in Spain. A lot of them are veterans, or at least had serious sympathies with the 1798 rebellion, hence that animosity with Sir John Moore, as I mentioned. And they're transferred to the east in and around 1812. And they suffer horrific casualties on that campaign. And there's a really good interaction between I think it might have been Ney, one of the marshals, and an Irish soldier. And the Irish soldier is being chastised by the marshal for not retreating yet. And the Irish soldier said, no, I had to. You don't understand. There was this Cossack who shot at me twice, so I needed to get him. And the marshal, well, did you get him? And he's like, yeah, no, he fell off his horse. I think I got him. So there's, it's still that Irish charm, I suppose, that wit. I guess it's bilingual, if nothing else. They suffered, as I said, fairly horrific casualties. I don't think they are involved specifically with the invasion, but I think they cover the retreat. But I haven't looked too much into that campaign. But to be honest, it seems to be a fairly common theme with Napoleon's allies at that stage, where they come out of Russia with 90% casualties or something horrific like that. So it's no surprise that this little Irish legion that's established is also, fairly wellied. They don't feature in the 100 Days at all. And to be honest, I think by 1814 they probably disbanded, or at least folded into something else. I think it is more up until 1812. That's when they are active. And yeah, that's, I suppose, yet another instance of the Irish serving abroad, be it in French or otherwise service. We get around, if nothing else.
Yeah, as you say, casualties during the Moscow campaign were just horrific. So it wouldn't be surprising if they were kind of disbanded and redistributed in the wake of that. In 1800, we've touched on this a little bit already, you get the Act of Union.
Right.
So how does that change things? Well, actually, first, how do the Irish feel about being suddenly told that they're part of the United Kingdom? I'm guessing the attitudes sort of vary.
Well, I guess, again, it comes down to what part of the country you're from and who you sympathize with. If you felt that 1798 was a just cause, this is the worst thing to ever happen to you. If you were terrified during the 1798 rebellion, and it's important, again, to drive home, and this is something a lot of Irish historians can sometimes stumble over, and Irish historical students, says he bitterly, is that nationalism does not necessarily equate to Irishness at this stage. It is very, very possible for you to be a loyalist to the crown and still consider yourself completely Irish, and a staunch Irishman at that. So if you are a loyalist and you believe that, Ireland should be, it's governed by a king, be it King of England, but the king of the Kingdom of Ireland, you might not necessarily view it as the worst thing in the world. And as I said earlier, for Catholics, a lot of them are promised emancipation as a result of this. So they might have actively supported it and campaigned for it. For the Irish Parliament themselves, it's important, again, to bear in mind that the Irish Parliament votes itself out of existence. There are 2 acts of union. There's the one the Irish Parliament signed, and there's the one the UK Parliament signed, but it was up to the Irish Parliament to eliminate themselves from the picture. So If you were of a certain group, you would be happily to retire with your massive bribe you were given to allow active union to even take place. If you're of another group, your sort of your Grattans and the like, you might have, been quite irritated at this, and the campaign then begins anew for home rule, and that happens almost immediately. In the same way that I'm sure that there are now campaigners for Brexit to be undone in the UK, you will always have an immediate campaign being launched, and it's much the same here with the active union, where there is a movement straight away to change things. But it's this, I suppose, it is difficult to fully nail down how everyone feels about it. I think for the soldier or the would-be soldier, it makes things a lot easier. You no longer have to worry about being of the Irish military establishment, because that's gotten rid of. So no longer is your pay coming from Dublin Castle, however sporadic that is. It's now all centralized in, the UK. You've got the establishment of things like the fencibles. So defence is, adjusted significantly, and there might be a degree of security to it as well. Clearly, the situation did not work in 1798, so something has to be done to remedy that. And if active union allows for more security, perhaps you'd agree with it. Those who don't agree with it, they turn into, what you see later on with the fight. And as active union does not manifest itself with Catholic emancipation, even post 1815, that's when you get the real emergence of your O'Connells and these characters who want to change things. But at the time, difficult to really nail down if people are incredibly positive or incredibly negative. I reckon there's both parties fairly strong, with a lot of people stuck in the middle, in the grey area, because nothing's black and white.
No, absolutely. I sometimes wish that some Napoleonic commentators would realise that there is grey areas, there are grey areas and nuances to be seen in pretty much everything. But anyway, little rant aside. So the active union, in your opinion, does it work in terms of what it's trying to achieve, of aiming to a degree bring the Irish and English, Scottish and Welsh together, but also kind of serving as a bit of a punishment to more effectively keep the Irish under control?
I think it is yes. I think the idea of it being a reaction to what has taken place and kind of a punishment, that's probably the argument that bears out, in my opinion, anyway, because it does abolish the last of the penal laws, technically, but it's essentially replaced them with a different form of governance. You now have no autonomy in Ireland. It is all being governed by Westminster. So it's a big slap on the wrist, as much for the sort of Protestant ascendancy who had been in charge, because it's clear that they cannot control things. And there's there have been movements towards union before, but it's really the failings of in and around 1798 that sort of justify its existence. So I think considering it as a punishment is definitely the best way to go about that. Yeah, is it effective? It's still active today, right? In a way, you're still looking at a situation where 6 counties are still considered part of the union between the United Kingdom. So in a way, it's an incredibly effective piece of legislation. And that's not me being nationalist or one way or the other. It's just a statement of fact. I think it does work. People do feel more ties to the crown. It's easier to not brainwash, but sort of manipulate people into believing that they're more closely associated with the crown. And by 1730s, you've got O'Connell coming about. So there's a very quick changeover and a very quick reaction to it, if nothing else.
Andrew, this has been brilliant. I was looking forward to this. A really different perspective, and one where, to be honest, I don't know a great deal, and I dare say that came across in the questions that I was asking. But thank you very much for joining me. This has been great.
Thank you for having me. That was great fun. Thank you.
That was Andy Dorman joining me to discuss the British Army in Ireland in the late 1700s. You can follow Andy on Twitter at Andy Dorman, and that's spelt with a double N and one O. Before you go, there are loads of ways that you can support this podcast for free. Remember to drop a like, subscribe, and share with friends. You can also help to fund The Napoleon Assist at no cost to yourself, whilst picking up a colossal discount on military history books at Naval and Military Press. Just click on the link that's in the description, shop as normal, and The Napoleon Assist will get 10% without you paying a penny more. A big thank you as ever to my patrons, whose support helps to cover the production costs of this podcast. If you'd like to join them, get an exclusive discount of 10% at Pen and Sword Books, and contribute to the aim of taking the Napoleon Assist weekly, you can find out more at patreon.com/the Napoleon Assist. A particularly big thanks to my mentioned in Dispatches patrons, Rob Griffith, Alex Churchill, an anonymous Canadian, Brendan Teeling, John Haynes, Anna Vakulenko, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Rory Muir, James Bevan, Lucy Tatner, and Jim Deary. As ever, you can find me on Twitter at ZWhiteHistory, and the conversation continues in the forum at thenapoleonicwars.net. Join me next time when I will be bringing you the final instalment of Irish Month, as I reprise the Voices Oral History project that came to you on the podcast in June, and use it to shine a light on the Irish experience. Next week we'll therefore see a special Voices from Ireland episode, as I guide you through a series of recordings that have been sent in by listeners of the Napoleon Assist, who have picked some of their favourite anecdotes by or about the Irish during the Napoleonic Wars. Until then, I'm Zach White. This has been the Napoleon Assist. Take care, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.
Hey, it's Danny Pellegrino from Everything Iconic. Ready to upgrade your style game without blowing your budget? Check out Quince. They've got all the good stuff, shirts and polos, activewear, and fine leather goods, all at 50 to 80% less than other high-end brands. And the best part? They're all about safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing. Get that luxury vibe without the luxury price tag. Hit up quince.com/upgrade for free shipping and 365-day returns on your next order. That's quince.com/upgrade.
Hi, I'm Daniel, founder of Pretty Litter. Did you know cats tend to hide symptoms of sickness and pain? I learned this the hard way after losing my cat, Gingy. So I created Pretty Litter, a health monitoring litter that helps detect early signs of illness by changing colors, saving you money and potentially your cat's life. Pretty Litter is veterinarian developed, and it's the easiest way to keep tabs on your fur baby's health right at home.
Go to prettylitter.com and use code ACAST for 20% off your first order and a free cat toy. Terms and conditions apply. See site for details.